rain hammered down on the corrugated iron roof of the abandoned factory, each drop a tiny explosion of sound in the oppressive silence. Inside, amidst the rusting machinery and pools of oily water, a lone figure crouched. He wore a clown suit, once vibrant, now faded and stained with something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. His face, painted white, was stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile, the ruby red lips cracked and peeling. This wasn't Pennywise. This was something else, something older, something hungrier. Let's call him Chuckles. Chuckles had been watching the town of Derry for a long time. He existed in the spaces between, the cracks in reality where fear festered and nightmares were born. He was drawn to Derry like a fly to rotting meat, the town's history of violence and tragedy, a feast laid out just for him. He fed on fear, on the primal terror that lurked in the darkest corners of the human psyche. And Derry, old Derry, was overflowing with it. He was aware of it, of course. The dancing clown, a pale imitation, a pretender to the throne of terror. Chuckles saw it as a noisy neighbor, a rival claiming territory that was rightfully his. He had watched its cycle of feast and famine, the 27 years of slumber followed by the frenzied feeding on the town's children. Chuckles found its methods crude, loud, messy, theatrical. Chuckles preferred a more subtle approach, a slow, insidious erosion of sanity, a gradual descent into madness that left his victims hollow, empty shells. It was time for it to wake soon. Chuckles could feel the anticipation, the thickening of the air with dread. But this time, things would be different. This time, there would be a new player in the game of fear. Chuckles would have his feast. 10 miles outside Derry, nestled amongst the pines and whispering oaks, lived the Collins family. John Collins, a hard-working carpenter, his wife Mary, a warm and loving homemaker, and their 2 children, 12-year-old David and 9-year-old Sarah. They were an ordinary family, living an ordinary life, blissfully unaware of the darkness that was slowly creeping towards them. David was on the cusp of adolescence, all gangly limbs and awkward silence. He loved to explore the woods surrounding their home, losing himself in the dappled sunlight and the scent of pine needles. Sarah, bright and inquisitive, was his shadow, tagging along on his adventures, her laughter echoing through the trees. One crisp autumn afternoon, David decided to explore an old, abandoned quarry he had stumbled upon during one of his solitary wanderings. He had told Sarah about it, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and excitement. "Can we go, David? Please, can we go?" she had begged, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. David, enjoying the feeling of being looked up to, had relented. They packed a knapsack with sandwiches and cookies, filled their canteens with water, and set off. Their parents, busy with chores, barely noticed their departure. The quarry was a gash in the landscape, a scar of grey rock and stagnant water. A chain-link fence, rusted and broken in places, surrounded the perimeter, a flimsy deterrent that did little to dispel the air of danger that clung to the place. David, feeling a thrill of bravado, pushed open a section of the broken fence, ushering Sarah through. "Stay close," he said, trying to sound authoritative. They walked along the edge of the quarry, their feet crunching on loose gravel. The air was cold and still, the water a dark, unreflecting mirror. David, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, pointed out the different colored rocks and the patterns in the striated rock face. Sarah, her initial excitement fading, clung to his hand. "It's kinda creepy here, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sighing of the wind. "Don't be a baby," David scoffed, though he couldn't deny the unease that was settling over him. He felt a sudden urge to leave, to get Sarah back to the safety of their home. But it was too late. The air shimmered, distorting the landscape around them. The familiar sounds of the woods, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves were replaced by a suffocating silence. Sarah whimpered, burying her face in David's jacket. And then he saw it. At the edge of the quarry, half hidden by the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, impossibly thin, its limbs like contorted branches. It wore the clown suit, faded and stained, and its face, oh God, its face. It was a mask of decaying flesh, stretched into a rictus grin, the eyes 2 black pits that burned with an unholy light. Chuckles. David, paralyzed by terror, could only stare. Sarah screamed, the sound thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. Chuckles turned his head towards the sound, his grin widening, and David felt something cold and slimy slithering into his mind, whispering promises of unimaginable delights, of fears realized and nightmares brought to life. He felt himself slipping, the world around him dissolving into a kaleidoscope of horror. And then darkness. John and Mary Collins were frantic. It was almost dusk, and their children were still missing. They had searched the woods, calling their names until their throats were raw, their hearts pounding with a dread that grew with each passing minute. John, a practical man, tried to remain calm. He reasoned that the children had simply wandered further than usual, gotten caught up exploring some new, hidden corner of the woods. But Mary, her maternal instincts screaming, knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a cold, gnawing fear that settled in her gut and refused to be dislodged. They alerted the authorities, and soon, a search party was combing the woods, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices echoing with a hollow hope. John and Mary, their faces etched with worry, followed behind, their every step heavy with despair. And then, a discovery. At the edge of the abandoned quarry, they found the knapsack, the contents scattered on the ground. A half-eaten sandwich lay on a rock, ants crawling over the exposed filling. Mary picked up a crumpled cookie, tears welling in her eyes. It was Sarah's favorite, the one with the pink icing. John, his face ashen, examined the broken fence, his mind refusing to accept the implications. The search continued through the night, but as the dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of grey and purple, hope dwindled. The children were gone, vanished without a trace. The authorities concluded that the children had likely fallen into the quarry, victims of a tragic accident. The case was closed, the search called off. But John and Mary Collins refused to believe it. They knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that their children were still out there, somewhere. And they were right. David woke to darkness, a darkness so complete, so absolute, that it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel anything except a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very marrow. Panic welled up inside him, threatening to overwhelm him. He called Sarah's name, his voice a croak of fear, but there was no answer. Only the suffocating darkness. He thrashed around, his hands coming into contact with rough, uneven surfaces. He was in a confined space, a small, cramped box. He remembered the knapsack, the sandwiches, the quarry, and then the clown. The terrifying, grinning clown. Chuckles. The memories came flooding back, a torrent of fear and confusion. He remembered Sarah's scream, the cold, slimy touch in his mind, the darkness that had swallowed them whole. Where was Sarah? Was she all right? Where were they? Panic turned to blind terror. David pounded on the walls of his prison, screaming Sarah's name until his voice was raw, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah, where are you? Help me. Please, someone, help me," he sobbed, his voice echoing in the darkness. But there was no answer. Only the mocking silence and the suffocating darkness that pressed down on him, heavier, heavier, until it threatened to crush him completely. Sarah was elsewhere, trapped in her own personal hell. She was in a room, if you could call it that. It was more like a giant, distorted dollhouse, the walls painted in garish colors, the furniture oversized and misshapen. Everything was wrong, off-kilter, designed to disorient and unsettle. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of rotting fruit, the floor sticky with something that Sarah didn't want to identify. In the corner, a pile of discarded dolls stared at her with blank, glassy eyes. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, a rabbit caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. And then she saw him. Chuckles stood in the doorway, his grotesque grin illuminated by a flickering light that cast long, grotesque shadows across the room. He held a balloon in one hand, a bright red balloon that bobbed obscenely in the stagnant air. "Come here, little one," he crooned, his voice a rasping whisper that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "I have something for you." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want to go home. I want my mommy." Chuckles chuckled, the sound a dry, rattling cough. "Mommy can't help you here, little one," he said. "Only I can. Come, take the balloon. It's full of happy dreams." He took a step towards her, and Sarah screamed, the sound echoing in the distorted space, bouncing off the walls, amplified and distorted, until it sounded like the cries of 1,000 tormented souls. Chuckles, unfazed, continued to advance. John Collins was a man of action, not words. He had spent weeks, months, searching for his children, following every lead, however tenuous, every whisper of a rumor, every fleeting hope. He had plastered the town with missing posters, their smiling faces staring back at him, a constant reminder of his loss. He had contacted psychics, mediums, anyone who claimed to have a connection to the other side, desperate for any scrap of information, any clue that might lead him to his children. But all his efforts had led to dead ends, to false hopes and crushing disappointments. The police had been no help. They had written the children off, victims of a tragic accident, their bodies lost in the depths of the quarry. John refused to believe it. He could feel them, somewhere out there, trapped, scared, calling out to him. He just didn't know how to reach them. One night, John had a dream. He was in the woods, the trees twisting and turning around him, the air thick with the smell of decay. He could hear Sarah laughing, a high-pitched, almost hysterical giggle. He followed the sound, pushing through the undergrowth, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw him, the clown, standing in a clearing, bathed in an eerie green light, a grin stretched across his decaying face. In his hand, he held a red balloon, the same red balloon that had haunted John's waking hours, appearing in the corner of his vision, floating on the breeze outside his window, taunting him, mocking him. John woke with a start, his sheets soaked in sweat. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the dream was more than just a dream. It was a message, a sign, a clue. The clown, the balloon, the quarry. It was all connected. He had to find the clown. He had to find his children. Mary Collins had retreated into herself, a ghost of the woman she once was. The loss of her children had broken something inside her, leaving her hollow, empty. She spent her days wandering the house, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes vacant. She barely spoke, her voice a raspy whisper when she did. John tried to reach her, to comfort her, but she was lost in her grief, unreachable. One afternoon, John came home to find Mary standing in the kitchen, her back to him. She was holding something in her hand, something small and red. "John," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Look." John approached cautiously. In Mary's hand was a balloon, a bright red balloon, bobbing gently in the still air. "Where did you get that?" John asked, his voice tight. Mary turned, her face illuminated by a strange, almost feverish light. "He gave it to me," she whispered. "He said it would make me happy again." "Who?" John demanded, his heart sinking. He knew the answer, but he needed to hear her say it. "The clown," Mary said, her voice flat, emotionless. "He said he has our children. He said he can bring them back." John felt a surge of rage, a primal fury that threatened to consume him. The clown had taken his children, had driven his wife mad with grief, and now he was taunting them, playing with them, like a cat with a mouse. John wasn't going to let him get away with it. He was going to find the clown, and he was going to make him pay. John and Mary, united in their grief and their desperate need for revenge, set out to find the clown. They followed the trail of red balloons, a macabre treasure hunt that led them deeper and deeper into the heart of Derry's darkness. The balloons appeared in the most unexpected places, tied to the fence of the local schoolyard, floating in the window of the bakery, bobbing on the surface of the canal. Each one was a taunt, a reminder of their loss, a challenge. They questioned the townsfolk, showing them pictures of their children, the red balloon always present in the background. Some people claimed to have seen the clown, a fleeting glimpse, a flash of red and white in the shadows. Others dismissed them, muttering about grief-stricken parents, their minds playing tricks on them. But John and Mary refused to be deterred. They knew what they had seen. They knew the clown was real. Their search led them to the library, to the local historian, a frail, elderly woman named Mrs. Kirsch. She listened to their story, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and recognition. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "The clown. He's been here for a long time, longer than anyone knows." She told them about Derry's history, about the cycles of violence, the disappearances, the whispers of a malevolent entity that fed on the town's fear. She told them about the Losers Club, the group of children who had faced the entity, who had thought they had defeated it. "But he's back," she said, her voice trembling. He's always back, and he's hungry. She pointed them to a book, a thick, leather-bound volume hidden on a dusty shelf. It's all in there, she said. Everything you need to know. John and Mary took the book, their hands shaking with anticipation. It was their only hope. The book was a chronicle of Derry's history, a record of its darkest secrets, its most primal fears. It told of a creature, a shapeshifter, that had haunted the town for centuries, preying on its inhabitants, feeding on their terror. It took on many forms, whatever its victims feared most: a werewolf, a mummy, a vampire. But its most common guise, the one that had become synonymous with Derry's terror, was that of a clown. The book told of the Losers Club, a group of children who had banded together to fight the creature, who had discovered its weakness, the power of belief, the strength of unity. They had faced their fears, their personal demons, and in doing so, they had weakened the creature, driving it back into its lair, into the darkness from which it had sprung. But the book also warned that the creature was not truly defeated. It was merely dormant, slumbering, waiting for the opportune moment to rise again. And when it did, it would be stronger, hungrier, more terrifying than ever before. John and Mary devoured the book, their eyes scanning the pages, their minds searching for a way to save their children. They had to find the creature's lair, they had to find its weakness, they had to find a way to fight it. The book provided a clue, a map, crudely drawn, depicting a network of tunnels beneath the town, a labyrinth of darkness and decay. At the heart of this labyrinth lay the creature's lair, the source of its power. John and Mary knew what they had to do. Armed with the book and fueled by a desperate hope, John and Mary descended into the tunnels beneath Derry. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and sewage, the walls slick with moisture. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the beam of their flashlight, which seemed to be swallowed by the shadows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the dripping of water and the skittering of unseen things. They followed the map, their hearts pounding in their chests. They passed by abandoned chambers, filled with the remnants of forgotten rituals, the air thick with a sense of ancient evil. They crossed over rushing streams, black and oily, their depths unfathomable. They climbed over piles of debris, the bones of long-dead animals crunching beneath their feet. The further they descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, the heavier the air, the colder the touch of the unseen things that brushed against their skin. They could feel the creature's presence, a malevolent force that seemed to permeate every inch of the tunnels, watching them, waiting for them. And then they heard it, a child's laughter. High-pitched, hysterical, echoing through the tunnels. It was Sarah's laughter. John and Mary exchanged a look, a mixture of hope and terror in their eyes. They quickened their pace, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. They rounded a bend, and there they were. David and Sarah were in a large chamber, a cavernous space lit by flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, disturbed in places by small footprints. In the center of the chamber stood a well, its mouth gaping open like a hungry maw. David was crouched on the floor, his back to the well, his arms wrapped around his knees. He was rocking back and forth, his eyes wide and unfocused, muttering to himself. Sarah was standing a few feet away, her back to John and Mary. She was holding a red balloon, her face illuminated by a strange, almost ethereal light. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft, almost dreamy. "Mommy, is that you?" John and Mary rushed forward, their hearts leaping with joy. They knelt beside their children, their arms enfolding them in a tight embrace. They were thin, pale, their eyes haunted, but they were alive. "It's okay," John murmured, stroking David's hair. "We're here now. We're going to take you home." But as he spoke, he noticed something was wrong. David's body was stiff, unyielding in his embrace. His eyes, though open, seemed to be looking through John, seeing something else, something terrible. And Sarah, her voice, though soft, was laced with a strange, almost mocking lilt. "You can't take us home, Daddy," she said, her grip tightening on the red balloon. "We're home now." She turned, her face illuminated by the flickering torchlight, and John gasped. Her eyes, they were no longer the eyes of a child. They were cold, black, filled with an ancient, inhuman malice. The creature had chosen its new form. It had taken the shape of their children, twisting their innocence, their love, into something monstrous, something terrifying. It had played with them, tortured them, broken them, and now it was using them, wearing them like masks, to mock their parents, to break them too. John and Mary were trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. They had come to rescue their children, only to find that their children were no longer their children. They had faced their worst fear, the loss of their children, only to find that the true horror was something far worse, something that defied comprehension, something that shattered the very foundations of their reality. The chamber was silent, the air thick with tension. John and Mary stared at their children, their faces etched with despair, their hearts breaking with each passing moment. They had failed. And then, a sound. A chuckle, dry and rattling, echoing through the chamber. The creature was enjoying their pain, reveling in their despair. It was feeding on their fear, growing stronger, more powerful. The torches flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. The well in the center of the chamber seemed to pulsate, its mouth gaping open, a black void that promised oblivion. John and Mary, their hope extinguished, their spirits broken, knew that this was the end. But they were wrong. There was a shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere, a ripple in the fabric of reality. The torches sputtered, their flames turning a sickly green. The shadows on the walls writhed and twisted, taking on monstrous shapes. The well in the center of the chamber roared, a guttural sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tunnels. And then he appeared. The dancing clown. He stood in the doorway, his form shimmering, unstable, his features shifting, morphing, a kaleidoscope of horror. He wore a clown's suit, billowing and tattered, stained with something that looked suspiciously like blood. His face, painted white, was stretched into a grotesque grin, the ruby red lips cracked and peeling. His eyes, two yellow orbs that burned with an unholy light, fixed on the creature children. The creature, startled, stepped back, its hold on David and Sarah weakening. The children whimpered, their eyes flickering with fear, their voices a mixture of the creature's malice and their own terrified pleas. "Help us," David whispered, his voice strained, barely audible. "It hurts," Sarah sobbed, her grip loosening on the red balloon. It, sensing the creature's vulnerability, advanced. He moved with a strange, jerky grace, his limbs contorting at unnatural angles, his head bobbing obscenely. He pointed a bony finger at the creature children. "You are not them," he hissed, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to scrape against their very souls. "You are not real." The creature snarled, its hold on the children tightening. "They are mine now," it roared. "They belong to me." "No," it said, his grin widening, his teeth lengthening, sharpening into needle-like points. "They belong to Derry, and I am Derry." He lunged, his form blurring, distorting, becoming a whirlwind of teeth and claws and tentacles and eyes. The creature screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as it enveloped it, consumed it, tearing it apart from the inside out. The children collapsed, their bodies racked with spasms, their eyes rolling back in their heads. John and Mary rushed forward, catching them before they hit the ground. They cradled their children in their arms, their tears falling freely, a mixture of grief and relief and terror and gratitude. It stood over them, his form still shifting, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "They are safe now," he rasped, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "But they will remember. They will always remember." And then he was gone, vanished back into the shadows, back into the darkness from which he had sprung. John and Mary carried their children out of the tunnels, back into the world of light and air. They took them to the hospital, where they were examined, treated, and pronounced physically healthy. But the doctors could do nothing for the scars that remained, the invisible wounds that ran deep, that would likely never fully heal. David and Sarah had no memory of their ordeal. They remembered going to the quarry, they remembered seeing the clown, and then nothing. A blank space, a void where the creature had resided, where it had waged war, where their innocence had been lost and found again. John and Mary decided to leave Derry. They packed their belongings, sold their house, and moved to a small town far away, a place where the air was clean and the shadows didn't whisper. They tried to create a new life for their children, a life filled with love and laughter and normalcy, but the past was never truly forgotten. The nightmares lingered, the shadows still held secrets, the red balloons appeared in the corner of their vision, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their world. And they knew with a chilling certainty that it was still out there, somewhere, waiting for the opportune moment to rise again, waiting for its next feast. The abandoned quarry stood silent, bathed in the pale moonlight. The chain-linked fence, rusted and broken, swayed gently in the breeze. The water in the quarry was still, black and unreflecting, a mirror to the darkness that lay beneath. And in the shadows, something stirred. Chuckles was back. His form was hazy, indistinct, but his grin was unmistakable, a grotesque parody of joy, a promise of terror to come. He had been weakened, but he was not defeated. He had tasted the fear of the Collins family, and he was hungry for more. He watched the town of Derry, its lights twinkling in the distance, a beacon to its darkest desires. He watched the children playing in the park, their laughter echoing through the night. He watched the couples strolling along the riverbank, their hands intertwined, their hearts oblivious to the danger that lurked just around the corner. He was biding his time, waiting for his moment, waiting for his next feast. And he would have it. He always did. For Chuckles, as for it, Derry was a never-ending buffet of fear, a smorgasbord of terror, a feast that would last for eternity.